8 armed men surrounded the car in the darkness, and the billionaire in the back seat realized she had nowhere left to run. Her CFO stepped out of the shadows holding documents that would strip her of everything she had built. Her driver sat perfectly still, hands resting on the wheel, watching through the rearview mirror. Nobody in that garage gave him a second thought. That was their first mistake, and before that night ended, it would not be their last. If this story already has you gripping the edge of your seat, you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss what happens next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see just how far this story travels. Now settle in, because this one doesn't let go. The rain started around 9 that evening, not the gentle kind that softens the edges of the city, but the aggressive, pounding kind that turned Manhattan's streets into shallow rivers and drove everyone sensible indoors. Rowan Mercer noticed it the way he noticed most things, without panic, without complaint, simply as a fact he would need to account for. He adjusted the wipers to their highest setting, checked his mirrors, and said nothing. In the back seat, Celeste Waverly hadn't looked up from her tablet in 20 minutes. She was 30 years old, built a billion-dollar investment empire before most people her age had figured out what they actually wanted from life. And she carried herself with the particular self-possession of someone who had been underestimated so many times that she had stopped bothering to correct people. Her company, Waverly Dominion, was 3 weeks away from closing the largest acquisition in its history, a deal that had taken 14 months of negotiations, 4 collapsed agreements, and more all-nighters than she could honestly count. Tonight should have felt like victory laps and celebration dinners. Instead, something was wrong, and she couldn't name exactly what. "Turn around," she said. "Take me back to headquarters." Rowan glanced at the clock. It was 9:47 p.m. "Yes, ma'am." That was the other thing about Rowan Mercer. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. This was, in Celeste's experience, an extraordinarily rare quality in people. Her attorneys asked unnecessary questions. Her directors asked unnecessary questions. Her assistant, Marcus, asked unnecessary questions, even when he was trying to help. Rowan simply processed the instruction and adjusted accordingly. She'd only been working with him for 11 days. The executive chauffeur service had assigned him to her temporary rotation, while her usual driver was recovering from knee surgery. She had barely registered him as a person during those 11 days, which was, she would later reflect with considerable embarrassment, exactly the kind of thinking that nearly cost her everything. She returned her attention to the tablet and the acquisition documents spread across 3 different applications. 1,400 pages of corporate language, financials disclosures, asset valuations, and legal representations. She had read most of it 3 times. Her legal team had read it 4. Her CFO, Malcolm Vane, had overseen the entire process personally, which was why the language on page 847 bothered her. It was subtle. Buried inside an indemnity clause that referenced a subsidiary holding structure she hadn't seen in any previous draft. The language created a mechanism complicated enough that most readers would absorb the surrounding legalese and miss it entirely, that allowed for a transfer of voting authority under specific board conditions. It was written to look like standard protective language, the kind of boilerplate that appeared in a dozen similar clauses throughout the document. But Celeste had a talent, one she'd developed through years of reading deals that other people wanted her to misread. She could hear the difference between language that protected her and language designed to look like it protected her while actually doing something else entirely. This language was doing something else entirely. She needed the original draft, the one from 8 months ago before Malcolm's team had begun consolidating revisions. That draft existed on a secure server at headquarters, not in any cloud system she could access from the car. "We're about 7 minutes out," Rowan said from the front. "Fine." The rain intensified. Lightning lit up the Hudson in the distance, briefly illuminating the skyline with the kind of dramatic clarity that seemed almost theatrical. Celeste wasn't looking at the view. She was running her memory of every conversation she'd had with Malcolm Vane over the past 4 months, searching for the things she'd missed. Malcolm had been with Waverly Dominion for 6 years. He was 51, meticulous, well-regarded in financial circles, and deeply committed, or so she had always believed, to the company's success. He had helped engineer 3 of their most profitable acquisitions. He sat 2 seats to her left at every board meeting. She had trusted him the way you trust a load-bearing wall. The car descended into the underground parking structure beneath Waverly Dominion's headquarters. Rowan pulled through the security gate, and the heavy mechanical door rolled shut behind them with a sound like a vault closing. Celeste was already unbuckling her seatbelt when Rowan slowed the car and stopped. "Ms. Waverly." His voice was different, not louder, not urgent, just different. Stripped of every unnecessary element, she looked up. 4 black SUVs were arranged in a loose semicircle ahead of them, their headlights cutting through the underground gloom. The parking level was otherwise empty at this hour. She knew the security rotation, knew that the overnight skeleton crew didn't begin until 10. It was 9:54 p.m. 8 men stood between and around the SUVs. They were dressed in dark tactical clothing, not the uniforms of any security service she recognized. Each of them was carrying something. Even from this distance, even in the fractured light of a half-lit parking garage, Celeste understood what she was looking at. "Rowan." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "What is this?" "I don't know yet," he said. "But don't open your door." He was watching the arrangement of men with an expression she couldn't read, calm, in a way that didn't seem possible for the situation. His eyes moving carefully from point to point across the garage as though he was solving a problem rather than witnessing a threat. A figure stepped forward from between the center 2 vehicles, and Celeste's stomach dropped. Malcolm Vane. In a dark overcoat, hair damp from the rain he'd walked through. Holding a leather portfolio, she recognized the kind their corporate attorneys used for signature ceremonies. He stopped 10 feet from the passenger side window and looked at her without any of the professional deference she was accustomed to seeing on his face. He looked, instead, the way someone looks when they've stopped pretending. "Celeste." He gestured toward the portfolio. "I need you to step out of the car." She didn't move. "What's in the folder, Malcolm?" "Documents that need to be signed tonight, before the board meeting tomorrow morning." "You could have called." "I did call." He smiled, and it was wrong, too patient, too controlled. "You've been ignoring my calls since 6 o'clock, which tells me you've found something in the draft, and I'm here to make sure that doesn't become a problem." In the front seat, Rowan had gone completely still. His hands remained on the wheel, but she noticed his eyes were moving not toward Malcolm, but across the entire garage. Exits, pillars, cameras, the spacing between the 8 armed men. He was doing something systematic, Malcolm. She kept her voice flat. "You've been with this company for 6 years, I have. And I've watched you make decisions worth billions of dollars. Tonight is the most important night of my career, Celeste, not yours." His expression didn't change. "Step out of the car." "No." He sighed an executive sigh, the kind meant to communicate that patience was a finite resource. "The men behind me are not particularly interested in what you want. This is not a conversation I'm asking you to participate in. I'm telling you that the documents are going to be signed tonight, and you are going to sign them. Whether you understand everything that's happening is frankly no longer relevant." Celeste said very quietly, "Who are they working for?" "The same people who are going to make sure Waverly Dominion survives what's coming under new management. You'll retain a symbolic position. You'll still have your name on the building. I've made certain of that. You're taking my company. I'm reorganizing it." He stepped closer. "There's a difference." Now, Celeste stepped out of the car. From the front seat, Rowan spoke quietly without turning around. "Ms. Waverly." She looked at him. "I need you to trust me for approximately 3 minutes." Something in his voice stopped her from asking the obvious question. He wasn't looking at her. He was still watching the garage, and there was something in the set of his shoulders, in the absolute stillness of him, that she had not seen in 11 days of daily car rides. She had categorized him as reliable, professional, and quiet. She was now revising that assessment significantly. "All right," she said. Malcolm rapped on the window. "Out of the car, Celeste, now." Rowan opened his door. The nearest guard moved immediately, a big man, wide through the shoulders, who clearly expected a chauffeur to get out, put his hands up, and step aside. He reached for Rowan's arm before Rowan had fully straightened. What happened next took less time than it takes to describe. Rowan moved with a kind of economy that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with precision. The guard's grab became a lever. The lever became a controlled fall. The controlled fall put 220 pounds of armed contractor onto the garage floor, in a way that took him out of the equation, without a sound that would alert the others before Rowan was ready. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, and during those 2 seconds, Rowan had already assessed the position of the remaining 7 men and identified the one gap in their coverage. He pulled Celeste's door open. "Maintenance door," he said. 10 o'clock. "Walk fast, Ms. Waverly." She walked fast. Behind them, Malcolm's voice cracked across the garage, the patient tone finally gone. Stop them. Don't let her leave this level. What followed was not a movie fight. There were no spectacular exchanges, no dramatic standoffs. Rowan was not trying to defeat anyone. He was trying to create just enough disruption and confusion to move one person from point A to point B through a space that had been set up to prevent exactly that. He used a concrete pillar to force 2 guards wide, bought himself 4 seconds, used a parked delivery van to eliminate 2 more sightlines, bought another 3 seconds, and got Celeste to the maintenance door before the remaining guards had reorganized enough to cut them off. The door was heavy, steel, not locked from this side. They went through. It closed behind them with a clang that echoed in the narrow service corridor. The corridor was dim, lit by emergency lighting strips along the floor, utilitarian and cold. They moved down it quickly, Rowan slightly ahead, his left hand out to steady Celeste if she stumbled on the uneven concrete. They could hear the pursuit reorganizing behind them, muffled through the steel door. Stairs, Rowan said, spotting a sign. Up 2 levels, then we get out of this building. There's a service exit on the 3rd sublevel. They'll know that exit. We go up. He glanced at her. Can you run? I'm wearing heels, but yes. Take them off. She did without argument, and they ran. Halfway up the first staircase, Celeste, breathing hard, heels in one hand, the other gripping the railing, said, You took that man down in 2 seconds. 1.5, Rowan said, not slowing. Who are you? He was quiet for the length of a full flight of stairs, and when he answered, his voice carried the particular flatness of someone reciting a fact they've had a long time to make peace with. Former Navy SEAL. 12 years, 2 deployments to places you've never heard of, one that almost killed me and 3 people I was responsible for. I got out 5 years ago when my sister died, and I became the only person who could raise my daughter. Celeste absorbed this. And now you drive for an executive service. It pays consistently. The hours are usually manageable. It's quiet. He pushed through a door at the top of the next landing. It was quiet. They emerged into a service corridor that connected to a neighboring commercial building, a detail Rowan had apparently noticed at some point during the past 11 days without telling her, because he navigated to it without hesitation. Behind them, through 2 heavy fire doors and a floor of steel corridor, Malcolm Vane's men were regrouping. They had vehicles. They had communications. They had the advantage of numbers and preparation. What they did not have was any idea what they were actually dealing with. Rowan pushed through one final door, and they came out into the lobby of the neighboring building, bright, warm. The overnight security guard at the desk already looking up in surprise at 2 rain-damp people appearing through the service entrance at 10 o'clock on a stormy Wednesday night. Rowan reached into his jacket pocket, produced his chauffeur service credentials, and addressed the guard with absolute composure. We need to use your lobby for a few minutes, he said. There's a situation next door. I'd recommend you contact your building security to log us as guests and monitor your service entrances. He set his credentials on the desk so the guard could verify them. I'm sorry for the interruption. The guard stared at them. Celeste straightened, pushed wet hair away from her face and said, in the voice she used for boardrooms, My name is Celeste Waverly. I own the building next to this one. We will not be here long. She said it the way people say things when they have no backup and are relying entirely on the weight of their own certainty, and it worked, because it almost always works, even when everything else has gone completely sideways. Rowan moved to a position near the lobby wall, where he could see both entrances and the service corridor they'd come from. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, watching. Celeste stood in the middle of the lobby floor, barefoot on cold marble, a billion-dollar empire crumbling somewhere in the paperwork behind her, and looked at the man she'd paid almost no attention to for 11 days. Your daughter, she said. Tessa. She's 9. He glanced at her briefly, then returned his attention to the entrances. She's with a neighbor tonight. She's fine. You didn't have to do what you just did. Yes, I did. Why? He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, just considering whether there was a shorter answer. Because you were in my car, he said finally, and someone tried to take you out of it against your will. That's not something I'm able to walk away from. It has never been something I'm able to walk away from. A pause. It's inconvenient sometimes. She almost laughed. Under different circumstances, she might have. Malcolm has nearly half the board, she said, thinking out loud now, the crisis engaging the same part of her brain that processed acquisitions and risk and strategy. He wouldn't have moved tonight unless he was certain of his numbers. Which means this isn't just him. There are directors I've trusted who are part of this. What do you need to prove it? evidence, specifically original drafts, internal communications, and the financial structure behind whatever they've built. If they've been siphoning money through the acquisition, there will be layers. Shell companies, intermediary accounts. Someone got paid, and money always leaves a trail if you know how to read it. Do you have somewhere you can work? Somewhere they won't think to look immediately? I know an attorney. Lenora Price, she's not connected to Waverly Dominion at all. She has her own secure setup. Call her. He was still watching the entrance. And don't use your company phone. She looked at the device in her hand, the one IT had provisioned, the one that ran through Waverly Dominion's communications infrastructure. Malcolm's people can monitor it, she realized. Yes. She set it on the marble floor, thought for exactly 1 second, and stepped on it deliberately with her bare heel. The screen cracked. She picked up the pieces, dropped them in a nearby trash can, and looked at Rowan.
Do you have a phone I can borrow?
He handed her a basic personal cell, an older model, a prepaid device, the kind that didn't link to anything. She stared at it for a moment. You just happen to have this. I always carry a backup, he said. Old habit. Outside, through the lobby's tall glass front, she could see the rain still hammering the pavement of the street. Somewhere on the other side of the building, men with radios were searching a parking garage and a corridor system, trying to find her. Malcolm Vane was standing in an empty space where a signature ceremony was supposed to have happened, recalculating. She thought about Tessa, 9 years old, staying with a neighbor, waiting for her father to come home from a job that was supposed to be quiet. She dialed Lenora Price's number from memory. It rang twice. Lenora, she said when the line connected. I know it's late. I need your office, your secure network, in about 4 hours. A pause. And I need you to understand that what I'm about to ask you is not going to be straightforward. Another pause, listening. Yes, it's that serious. I'll explain when I get there. She ended the call and looked at Rowan. She's in. How do we get across town without Malcolm's people seeing us? Rowan thought for a moment, the same systematic, unhurried, thinking she'd watched him apply to the garage, and said, we walk 2 blocks south, go into the first hotel with a lobby entrance on both sides, cross through it, exit on the other street, and take a cab from there. No rideshare apps, cash only. I don't have cash. I do. She stared at him. You're very prepared for a man who drives executives to dinner appointments. He looked at her with something that might, under better circumstances, have been quiet amusement. 12 years as a SEAL, he said. You stop trusting situations to stay simple. Outside, the rain continued. The clock on the lobby wall read 10:23 p.m. 7 hours until the board meeting. 7 hours to save everything she had built. She picked up the borrowed phone, took a breath that tasted like cold marble and wet concrete, and the particular clarity that comes when everything unnecessary has been stripped away, and said, then let's go. The hotel they cut through was the kind of place that existed in the middle of Manhattan, like a pocket of forced calm, all warm light and leather furniture, and a pianist playing something forgettable near the bar. The overnight staff moved with the quiet efficiency of people trained not to notice anything that might inconvenience a guest, which meant that a barefoot woman in a tailored blazer and a man with a bruised knuckle, crossing the lobby at 10:30 on a rainy Wednesday night, received nothing more than a polite nod from the concierge. Rowan had Celeste through the far exit in under 90 seconds. The street on the other side was narrower, less trafficked, and within 2 minutes he had flagged a cab, with a cash fare already in his hand. He gave an address 3 blocks from Lenora Price's office building, rather than the building itself. Another old habit, the kind you develop when you've spent enough time in environments where the difference between a safe arrival and a compromised one is a single detail you overlooked. Celeste got in first. He followed. The cab moved. Neither of them spoke for the first few minutes. The city slid past the windows in wet streaks of light, and the driver had the radio on low something that might have been news, or might have been talk, too quiet to parse through the glass partition. Celeste was staring straight ahead, but her eyes had the particular unfocused quality of someone running calculations rather than seeing anything. Rowan watched the side mirror. You're checking if we were followed, she said, without turning. Yes. Are we? Not yet. He kept watching for another block, then relaxed fractionally. We're clean. She let out a breath that had been sitting in her chest since the parking garage. Malcolm will know I called someone. He'll assume I ran. He won't assume I'm going on offense tonight. That assumption is an advantage. Don't waste it. She turned to look at him then, really look, the way she hadn't in 11 days of daily proximity. He had the kind of face that defaulted to stillness, not blankness, which was a meaningful distinction. There was processing happening behind it. continuous and quiet. The bruised knuckle on his right hand was the only external evidence of what had occurred in the garage 40 minutes ago. Everything else about him looked the same as it always had. "Does your hand hurt?" she asked. He glanced at it. "A little. I don't even know if I thanked you." "You don't need to thank me." "I know I don't need to. I'm saying I want to." She paused. "Thank you, Rowan." He nodded once, the kind of nod that acknowledged the words without making a ceremony of them. "We can sort out gratitude later. Right now, I need you to tell me everything about Malcolm Vane that you didn't tell your board." She frowned. "What makes you think there's anything I didn't tell the board?" "Because you run an investment empire, and you've known this man for 6 years, and something made you ignore his calls today instead of confronting him directly. That means you already had a suspicion before tonight. And suspicions that specific usually have a source." The cab hit a red light. Rain drummed the roof. Celeste was quiet for a moment, not reluctant, just organizing. 8 months ago, she said, Malcolm brought me a new analyst. Young woman, very sharp, named Petra Solis. He recommended her personally, said she'd been referred through a contact of his. I hired her because her credentials were legitimate and her work was excellent. 6 months later, she resigned. Gave standard reasons. But 2 weeks before she resigned, she left a folder on my desk, a physical folder, not emailed, not logged with a single page inside it. What was on the page? A partial account number and the name of a holding company I didn't recognize. That was all. No note, no explanation. When I tried to reach her after she left, the contact information she'd given HR was already disconnected. "You kept the page." "Of course I kept it." "And you didn't tell the board." "I didn't tell anyone. Because if I was wrong and it meant nothing, I'd have accused my own CFO of fraud based on a scrap of paper left by a former employee. And if I was right..." She stopped. "If you were right," Rowan said, "you needed more before you moved." "Yes." She met his eyes. "I've been quietly looking for 8 months. I found fragments, a pattern of wire transfers that seemed irregular, a subsidiary disclosure that didn't match the quarterly report, 2 shell entity names that appeared once in documents and never again. Nothing I could take to a regulator. Nothing that held together without the piece I was missing." She paused. "The clause I found tonight in the acquisition draft is the piece. Explain it to me." She did, and to his credit, he followed it, asking 2 precise questions at exactly the right moments, which told her he understood corporate structure better than most people who hadn't spent their careers in finance. She got the impression that Rowan Mercer, in another version of his life, could have been good at almost anything he chose to apply himself to. What she was looking at was a man who had been applying himself, for the past 5 years, to the task of being adequate, not because he was incapable of more, but because adequate was what kept Titsa fed and safe and in school. That thought sat uncomfortably with her, and she filed it away. For a moment, she had more room to examine it. The cab stopped. Rowan paid. They got out into the rain. Lenora Price's building was a 12-story structure on a quiet midtown block, home to a small collection of boutique legal and financial firms that catered to clients who valued discretion above all else. Lenora's firm occupied the 7th floor. At 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night, the building's lobby was empty, except for a guard, and the elevator ride up was silent. Lenora was waiting at the door of her firm when they arrived. She was 62, thin, with silver hair cut short, and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she looked at Celeste the way someone looks when they've been expecting bad news long enough that its arrival is almost a relief. She was in a charcoal cardigan over slacks, which meant she'd been home and come back, which meant she'd understood from the phone call that this was serious. "You look terrible," Lenora said. "Thank you, Lenora." "Who is this?" "Rowan Mercer. He works for me. Currently, he's also the reason I'm standing here instead of signing documents in a parking garage under armed duress." Lenora looked at Rowan for a long moment, the way lawyers look at people when they're deciding what category to put them in. "Armed duress," she repeated. 8 men, Celeste said. "Malcolm's people." Lenora stepped back and held the door open. "Come in and tell me everything." The firm's conference room was large enough for 10 people, but tonight held 3, with a whiteboard, a secure laptop, and a pot of coffee that Lenora produced from somewhere in the back without being asked. Rowan accepted a cup, but didn't sit. He stood near the windows, positioned to see the street below, a habit so ingrained he probably didn't notice he was doing it. Celeste wrapped both hands around her own cup and laid out everything, the analyst, the folder, the fragments, the clause, and what had happened in the garage, piece by piece, in the measured and precise way she presented quarterly results to difficult investors. Lenora listened without interrupting, which was one of the things that made her exceptional at her work. When Celeste finished, Lenora said, "The clause you described transfer of voting authority under specific board conditions. How specific are the conditions?" "Specific enough to be triggerable at tomorrow's meeting if the right motions are made in the right order." Which Malcolm controls. Which Malcolm controls. He has 4 directors. I'm now fairly certain he's compromised. Possibly 5. That gives him enough to push procedural motions through without a clear majority block. Can you prove the compromised directors? Not tonight, but I can prove Malcolm. Celeste set down her coffee. The subsidiary I found in the documents tonight cross-references an entity that appeared in Petra Solis's note 8 months ago. If I can access my private archive, the one I built outside company systems, specifically because I knew something was wrong, and cross that entity against the financial disclosures Malcolm filed, I can establish the connection. Where's the archive? Encrypted partition on a personal server I maintain separately from Waverly Dominion's infrastructure. I can access it from here. Lenora slid the secure laptop across the table without another word. For the next 40 minutes, the conference room was very quiet. Celeste worked, and Lenora read over her shoulder, and occasionally asked a question, and Rowan watched the street and drank his coffee and said very little, because what was happening at the table required silence and concentration, and he understood that his particular skill set was not needed for this part. What they found was not clean or simple. It never was. The financial structure Malcolm had constructed over 3 years, and it was 3 years, they established that within the first 20 minutes was built in layers, each one designed to create distance from the previous. There were 4 shell companies, each registered in a different jurisdiction, each serving as a pass-through for funds that originated from an outside investment group, with a neutral-sounding name, Hargrove Capital Partners. The name appeared nowhere in Waverly Dominion's official records. It was attached to nothing Celeste or her attorneys had ever reviewed. Hargrove Capital Partners had, over 26 months, transferred approximately $14 million into accounts connected to Malcolm Vane through 2 of the shell entities. The other 2 shell entities held something more troubling than money. They held a financial position, a very large, very deliberate short position against Waverly Dominion's publicly traded assets. Celeste stared at the screen for a long time. "They're not just stealing the company," she said. Her voice was flat. "No," Lenora said, "they intend to destroy it. They take control through the acquisition clause. They implement the board changes. Malcolm's been engineering for months. They tank the stock, and Hargrove collects on the short position. Conservatively," Lenora said, "based on the position size, they would clear somewhere between $80 and $120 million on the collapse, using my company as the mechanism." Celeste pressed 2 fingers against her eyes. They needed a company big enough to move the market. I spent 14 months building this acquisition, and they spent 3 years building a scheme to turn it into a bomb. Rowan spoke from the window. "Malcolm doesn't have all of that money for himself." Both women looked at him. $14 million in payments. That's his cut. Hargrove's principals are the ones clearing $80 to $120 million. Who runs Hargrove? Lenora was already typing. After a few minutes, she said, "Hargrove Capital Partners is registered in Delaware. The managing principals are listed as a law firm acting in nominee capacity standard structure for entities that don't want their ownership visible." She kept reading. "But there's a contact address on the original registration that matches a building in Midtown where I know 2 people have offices." She said the 2 names. Neither of them meant anything to Rowan, but Celeste's expression changed in a way that was difficult to describe. Not surprise, exactly, but the particular quality of a suspicion that has just been confirmed after a very long time. "One of them was on my shortlist for a board seat 2 years ago," she said quietly. "I passed on him. He was gracious about it." "Apparently not," Lenora said. The room was quiet. Outside, the rain had lessened to a steady drizzle. The street below was nearly empty. Rowan watched a cab move slowly through standing water near a blocked drain. His coffee had gone cold. He didn't particularly notice. He was thinking about the board meeting. "What time does it start?" he asked. 8 a.m., Celeste said. "It's almost 1. Malcolm will try to reach you tonight. He'll either make another direct move, or he'll try to create a situation that prevents you from appearing at the meeting. If you're not present, can his motions proceed?" "With a quorum, yes. Which he has if his directors hold. Then being absent is not an option." "No." She straightened in the chair, the kind of straightening that isn't physical recovery so much as decision. "I go to the meeting." Lenora looked at her. You walk in there with what we have tonight, and you could end his career. I could end more than his career. I could end the whole structure, the shell companies, the short position, Hargrove's principles. But only if I walk in there before he does and I have the room. There are people on that board you still trust, Lenora said. 3, possibly 4. And there's one person I should have called 3 months ago, when I first started thinking something was seriously wrong. Celeste paused. Margaret Ellison. Rowan looked at her. Senior Director, Celeste said. She's been on medical leave back surgery. She's been out for 6 weeks. I know she's back home, recovering. Malcolm has kept her completely out of the loop during her absence, which I accepted at the time because it seemed considerate. She stopped. That was stupid of me. He kept her away deliberately, Lenora said. Yes, Margaret is the one person on that board who has known me since before Waverly Dominion existed. She would have seen what was coming 3 months before I did. Celeste picked up Rowan's borrowed phone from the table. Can I call her? It's 1 in the morning, he said. I know, she'll answer. She dialed. It rang 5 times, and then a woman's voice answered, husky with sleep but sharpening quickly as Celeste spoke. Rowan heard only one side of the conversation, but he could track it from Celeste's end, the quick summary, the measured responses on the other end. 2 questions that caused Celeste to pause and gather herself, and then a longer silence before Celeste said, I know it's a lot to ask. I know you're still recovering. I'm not asking you to do anything physically difficult. I need you in that room, Margaret. I need them to see you walk in. A pause. Lenora will handle the documentation. All you need to do is be there. Another pause, and then something shifted in Celeste's face, a letting go of something she'd been holding. Thank you. I mean that. She set the phone down. She'll be there, she told Lenora. Lenora nodded slowly, with the expression of someone reassessing their odds upward. Then let's prepare what you're going to say. What followed was 2 hours of work that Rowan would later describe, if anyone asked, as the most impressive thing he'd witnessed in a career that included 12 years of operating in environments that were not forgiving of errors. Not because of what was being built, the evidence package, the presentation of the financial structure, the sequencing of revelations, but because of the people building it. Lenora Price moved through the material with the efficiency someone who had been doing this work for 35 years and had no interest in being impressive about it. And Celeste worked the way combat operators worked, Rowan thought, which was to say, without sentiment about the situation and without hesitation about the next step, processing each piece as it arrived and incorporating it into a running picture that she was continuously updating. She was afraid. He could see it not in obvious ways, but in the small ways that people who've learned to suppress fear cannot entirely hide. The grip on her coffee cup. The half-second pause before she spoke in moments when the evidence against her was particularly stark. The way her jaw set slightly differently when a line of inquiry led somewhere worse than she'd expected. She was afraid, and she was working anyway, which was the only definition of courage that had ever meant anything to him. Around 2:30 in the morning, Rowan got up and moved to the small kitchen adjacent to the conference room, where he found the makings of a fresh pot of coffee. He made it, came back with 3 cups, and set them on the table without being asked. Thank you, Lenora said, without looking up from her screen. Celeste looked up. You've been standing near that window for 2 hours, mostly sitting. Are you tired? I'm fine. That's not what I asked. He considered it honestly. I'm used to operating on less sleep than this. But yes, I'm tired. It's fine. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't categorize. You have a 9-year-old daughter, she said. And you're in the middle of this because you were doing your job tonight. I'm in the middle of this because what Malcolm's people tried to do in that garage was wrong. Those are different things. He picked up his coffee. Tessa's fine. She stays with our neighbor Helen when I have late pickups. Helen has 3 grandchildren and makes better pasta than anyone I've ever met, so Tessa genuinely prefers it. Does she know what you used to do? Tessa? She knows I was in the Navy. She knows I did things that were dangerous. She's 9, so she mostly thinks that's interesting rather than understanding what it actually means. He paused. She'll understand more when she's older. I don't hide it from her. I just don't lead with it. Celeste was quiet for a moment. Why did you really stop? Was it just about Tessa? It was a direct question and a personal one, and a lot of people would have deflected it. He didn't. My sister's name was Dana, he said. She was 4 years younger than me. After our parents died, she was mostly on her own because I was deployed. She managed. She was good at managing, and then she got sick, and there was nobody to manage anything for her, and by the time I got back it was already very far along. He stopped, and the pause was not for effect. She died 14 months after the diagnosis. Tessa was 3. I had about 6 days to process what had happened before I became someone's primary parent. The SEALs were going to send me back out in 2 months. So you left. I left, and I do not regret that decision. Not for a single day. He said it directly, without drama. But I'll be honest, the part where I'm supposed to find something else to be, outside of being Tessa's father, that part I haven't entirely figured out. Celeste held his gaze for a beat longer than was necessary, and then she turned back to the screen without saying whatever she'd been about to say. Lenora, who was not unobservant, said nothing and kept working. By 3:45 in the morning, they had what they needed. Not everything the evidence wasn't perfect, wasn't airtight in every particular, and Lenora was clear-eyed about which elements a good defense attorney would target and why. But it was enough. Enough to expose the shell company structure, enough to demonstrate the payments to Malcolm, enough to show the short position and its connection to Hargrove's principles, and enough critically to prove that the acquisition clause had been deliberately engineered as a mechanism for corporate theft. It was, Lenora said, more than enough to warrant federal attention. I'm going to make 2 calls, she told Celeste. One to a contact at the Securities and Exchange Commission I've worked with on financial fraud cases before. The other to someone at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Tonight or this morning, technically. I want those calls logged before your board meeting starts. Will they move on it today? They won't arrest anyone at a board meeting, if that's what you're asking. But having those calls on record changes the legal landscape significantly. Malcolm and his people will know, once you lay this out in the boardroom, that the clock is running. Celeste nodded. Do it. Lenora took her phone and stepped into the adjacent office. The door clicked shut. In the conference room, alone for the first time since the parking garage, Celeste and Rowan sat with the remnants of cold coffee and printed documents, and the specific kind of tiredness that comes not from the hour, but from sustained high-stakes concentration. You don't have to come to the meeting, Celeste said. I know. Your job was to get me from one point to another. You've done that. She looked at him levelly. What happens in that boardroom is my problem. Yes, he said, and I'm going to be there anyway. She opened her mouth. Because someone may try to remove you from the room physically before you finish presenting, he said. Malcolm has demonstrated tonight that he's willing to use contracted security outside legal boundaries. I don't expect him to repeat that in a boardroom full of witnesses, but I'd rather be wrong about it in a room where I'm present than be wrong about it from somewhere else. She stared at him. You've thought about this. I've been thinking about it for the last 4 hours. And if everything goes well, if the evidence is enough and the board unites behind me and Malcolm is suspended pending investigation, then I'll drive you home, he said. And that's the end of it. Something shifted in her expression, something that had to do with the particular loneliness of people who make large decisions alone and have done so for long enough that they've stopped noticing the weight of it. Right, she said quietly. The end of it. She looked down at the documents spread across the table. Her company's financial anatomy dissected and laid out under conference room. Lighting at 4 in the morning. Her CFO's betrayal rendered in account numbers and wire transfer records. 6 years of trust converted into evidence. I built this company from a pitch deck and a borrowed conference room, she said. It wasn't quite to him and wasn't quite to herself. I was 23. I didn't know what I was doing. I just knew that nobody in the room was going to take me seriously unless I made them. So I made them. A pause. I never thought the threat would come from inside. It almost always does, Rowan said. The threats from outside are the ones you prepare for. The ones from inside are the ones that get in through the door you left unlocked because you trusted the person on the other side. She looked at him. Dana? She asked quietly. He was quiet for a moment. No, that was different. That was just life being cruel. He wrapped his hands around the cold coffee cup. I mean, in general. The way things fail is usually from inside. Lenora came back into the room. Both calls made. I have callback numbers and case reference codes for both. The SEC contact says he'll have someone monitoring electronic trading activity on Waverly Dominion's listed assets starting at market open. She sat down. Now, do you want to try to get 2 hours of sleep before we go, or do you want to keep preparing? Celeste looked at Rowan. He shrugged slightly. Your call. We keep preparing, she said, and pulled the closest document toward her, and the work continued into the dark hours of the early morning, while the rain outside finally quietly stopped. The streets below glistened under yellow streetlights. Manhattan at 4 a.m. had the particular quality of a city that never stops, but occasionally breathes fewer voices, fewer sirens, just the wet hiss of the occasional cab, and the distant sound of someone's world going on regardless. In a midtown conference room, three people who had no particular reason to trust each other assembled the tools to walk into a boardroom at sunrise and take back something that had very nearly been stolen. And in the parking garage 11 blocks away, Malcolm Vane's men had packed up and gone, leaving behind only tire marks and the quiet evidence of a plan that had not gone the way anyone intended. Malcolm himself had made 4 calls in the past 3 hours and received 4 unsatisfying answers. He did not yet know exactly what had gone wrong, but he was beginning to understand that the chauffeur, the quiet man he had dismissed as furniture, had been something considerably more than that. He would need to adjust. What he didn't know, sitting in the back of his own car in the early hours of Thursday morning, was that adjusting was no longer going to be enough. The evidence was already assembled. The calls had already been made. The clock was already running. And when the sun came up over Manhattan 4 hours later, Celeste Waverly walked out of Lenora Price's building with printed documents under one arm and a stillness about her that had nothing to do with and everything to do with someone who has decided, completely and without reservation, that they are not going to lose. Rowan walked beside her. Neither of them spoke. The morning air was cold and clean after the rain, and the city was waking up around them in its particular indifferent way. And somewhere across Midtown, in a glass-walled boardroom on the 42nd floor of Waverly Dominion's headquarters, 8 directors were preparing to arrive at a meeting that was supposed to end one woman's empire. They were not prepared for what was about to walk through the door. The elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor at 7:41 in the morning, and Celeste Waverly stepped out like she owned the place, which she did, though that fact had been under serious threat for the past 10 hours. The lobby outside the boardroom was empty except for Marcus, her assistant, who was standing near the reception desk with a tablet in one hand and the expression of someone who had been sending unanswered messages into a void since the previous evening and had arrived early specifically to intercept whoever walked off that elevator first. When he saw Celeste, the relief on his face lasted approximately 2 seconds, before it was replaced by something closer to alarm, because she was wearing the same clothes as yesterday. Her hair was pulled back in a way that suggested function rather than intention, and the man beside her was not a board member or an attorney he recognized. Ms. Waverly. Marcus fell into step. I've been trying to reach you since last night. Mr. Vane called 3 times asking whether you'd been in contact with me. He said there was he called it a security situation involving your car. There was, Celeste said, not breaking stride. It's been handled. Is the room set up? Yes, since 6:30. But Waverly, Mr. Vane also sent a message to all directors last night indicating that you had experienced a personal emergency and might not be available for today's meeting. He suggested the agenda proceed with him chairing. Celeste stopped walking. She turned to look at Marcus fully. He sent that to all directors at 11:47 p.m. Yes. She absorbed this without any visible expression, which Rowan had come to understand was not the absence of a reaction, but the containment of one. She was filing it, adding it to the picture, accounting for the fact that Malcolm had spent the night attempting to establish, on the record, a reason for her absence before she'd had a chance to appear. Cancel whatever framing he created, she told Marcus. Send a message to all directors right now, from my personal account, not the company account that I am present, I am well, and the meeting will proceed as scheduled under my chairmanship. Do it before 7:50. Marcus was already typing. Done in 60 seconds. Anything else? I'm expecting 2 additional people. One is Lenora Price. She's my personal attorney. She has no Waverly Dominion affiliation, and she will be accompanying me into the boardroom as a legal observer. The second is Margaret Ellison. Marcus looked up. Ms. Ellison is on medical leave. Ms. Ellison called me at 1 this morning to say she'd be here. If she's not in the lobby already, she will be shortly. When she arrives, bring her directly to me. Celeste resumed walking. And Marcus, don't tell anyone she's coming, not Mr. Vane, not his assistant, not the other directors. Just bring her to me. Understood. One more thing. She stopped at the boardroom door and looked back at him. The building security for this floor, who's on duty today? Hendricks and Park, the usual team. Are they Malcolm's people or mine? Marcus blinked. It was a question that had never been asked before in exactly those terms, and its existence told him something was fundamentally different about this morning. Yours, he said carefully. They report to building security operations, not to Mr. Vane. Good. They stay on this floor. Nobody escorts them elsewhere for any reason during the next 2 hours. Tell them that came from me personally. She pushed open the boardroom door and went in. The room was long, glass-walled on 2 sides to give it the feeling of being suspended above the city, which on a clear morning after rain was striking the skyline crisp and washed, the light coming in at an angle that made everything look sharper than usual. The table seated 12. The projection screen at the far end was dark. Document packets had been placed at each seat prepared by Malcolm's team, Celeste noted, which meant she needed to replace them. She set her own materials at the head of the table and looked at Rowan. There are going to be people in this room who recognize the situation the moment they see you standing here, she said. Malcolm's directors. They'll know something went wrong last night. I know. If they try to have you removed, they can try, he said, in a tone that was not aggressive, simply accurate. I'm here as your designated security personnel. You have the right to have security present. If someone wants to argue that in front of a room full of directors at a meeting where you're about to present evidence of corporate fraud, let them. She considered this. Have you always been this difficult to argue with? Tessa says yes. Something moved across her face that was almost a smile, and then she turned to the table and began removing Malcolm's document packets from the seats and replacing them with her own. Lenora arrived at 7:52 with a rolling case of organized materials, and the particular composed authority of someone who had appeared in rooms like this many times and found them no more intimidating than a well-lit office. She sat to Celeste's left, opened her case, and began organizing without preamble. The directors began arriving at 7:55. Rowan stood near the wall to the right of the door, not blocking it, not aggressive in his positioning, but present in the way that a piece of furniture is not present. He watched each person come through the door the same way he'd watched the parking garage the previous night, cataloging, assessing, filing. He recognized the honest ones quickly. They were the people who saw Celeste at the head of the table and visibly relaxed small releases of tension in the shoulders, micro-expressions of relief. These were people who had received Malcolm's message the previous night and found it troubling. He recognized Malcolm's people almost as quickly. They came in together, 3 men and a woman, arriving within 90 seconds of each other, which was probably not coincidental, and when they saw Celeste seated calmly at the head of the table, with printed materials already distributed, and a woman they didn't know seated to her left, something moved through their group like a current. Not panic, recalculation. One of the men, heavyset, late 50s, with the careful dress of someone who considers his appearance a professional tool, paused near the door and looked at Rowan, not casually, with the specific attention of someone who knows they're looking at a variable they hadn't accounted for. Rowan looked back at him. The man sat down. Malcolm arrived at 8:03, and he came in the way powerful people enter rooms when they expect the room to belong to them, unhurried, unbothered, carrying the specific gravity of someone who has decided in advance that the situation is under control. He was in a dark suit, fresh, composed. Nothing about his appearance suggested he'd spent the previous night managing the failure of a plan he'd built over 3 years. He stopped when he saw Celeste. It was barely a hitch in his stride, over in half a second, but Rowan caught it. The micro-adjustment, the rapid processing behind the controlled face. Then Malcolm saw Rowan, and that was different. That one lasted longer. Celeste, Malcolm said, recovering. He moved toward his seat, which was no longer set with his materials. I'm glad you're feeling better. I sent a message to the directors last night because your driver indicated you'd had some kind of incident. And my driver is standing against the wall, Celeste said. He's been with me since last night. You can ask him directly about the incident, if you'd like. Malcolm looked at Rowan again. That's unnecessary. I'm simply glad you're here. I'm sure you are. She gestured at the chair 2 seats to her left. Please sit down, Malcolm. We have a lot to get through this morning. He sat. His 4 directors were watching Celeste with expressions that varied between careful neutrality and something closer to discomfort. The 3 honest directors, a woman named Sandra Chu, a man named Victor Osi, and a younger director named James Ritter, had settled into their seats with the attentiveness of people who had picked up on the room's unusual charge and were waiting to understand it. There was 1 empty seat. At 8:07, the boardroom door opened and Marcus stepped in. Behind him, moving carefully and with the slight deliberateness of someone managing residual physical discomfort, was a woman of about 65 with gray-streaked dark hair, good posture despite everything, and the kind of face that has seen enough of the world to stop performing reactions it doesn't feel. Margaret Ellison. Malcolm's reaction to her entrance was the most revealing thing that had happened in the room so far, and that included his reaction to Celeste herself. It lasted perhaps 1 second, a genuine, unguarded moment in which his composure actually broke, not dramatically, but enough. Enough for Rowan to see it. Enough, he suspected, for Celeste to see it. Margaret made her way to her seat without rushing, without acknowledging Malcolm's stare, without any indication that she found her own presence here remarkable. She sat down, folded her hands on the table, and looked at Celeste. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning, Margaret. Thank you for being here. I wouldn't have missed it." She said it mildly, the way people say things that are completely true and require no elaboration. Malcolm had recovered. His voice when he spoke was steady. "Margaret, I wasn't aware you'd been cleared for the meeting. Your physician indicated." "My physician indicated I should avoid strenuous physical activity," Margaret said. "Sitting at a table is within my current capabilities." One of the honest directors, Victor Osi, produced a sound that was technically a cough. Celeste let the moment settle, and then she said, "Let's begin." She stood. What followed in the next 45 minutes was the most deliberate, methodical, and controlled demolition Rowan had ever witnessed, and he had witnessed several, in circumstances considerably less formal. Celeste did not raise her voice. She did not perform anger or outrage or betrayal. She laid out the evidence the way a surgeon opens a body, with precision and without sentiment, because sentiment was a distraction from what needed to be seen. She started with the acquisition clause. She put the relevant page on the projection screen and walked the room through the language, sentence by sentence, explaining what it did and what it had been designed to look like it was doing instead. Two of the honest directors had their own copies open within 90 seconds, following along, and she could see the moment it landed for each of them, the small, unmistakable shift in expression as they crossed from not understanding to understanding too well. Malcolm said, "That language is standard protective." "I have the draft from 8 months ago," Celeste said, and put it on the screen beside the current version. "This clause does not appear in any draft prior to the revision cycle that your team managed exclusively, Malcolm. It was inserted between Revision 5 and Revision 6. I have the version control timestamps." She moved to the shell companies. This was where Lenora's organizational precision paid off. The structure was complex enough that walking a room of non-specialists through it required care, and Celeste had spent 2 hours in the early morning preparing exactly this explanation, building it incrementally, establishing each entity before connecting it to the next, creating a picture that accumulated rather than overwhelmed. By the time she reached Hargrove Capital Partners and the pattern of payments that flowed from it into accounts connected to Malcolm Vane, the room had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight. Malcolm was watching the screen. His face was doing something complicated and controlled. His 4 directors, the compromised ones, had collectively adopted expressions that differed from his, and that difference was informative. While Malcolm was recalculating, they were beginning to understand that they were in a room where the evidence already existed, where federal contacts had already been made, and where their continued association with his position was going to require a decision they had not been prepared to make this morning. "I want to note for the record," Lenora said, speaking for the first time, "that as of 6:47 this morning, I have logged contact with the Securities and Exchange Commission and the U.S. Attorney's Office, both of which have assigned case reference numbers to the information provided. Those reference numbers are on the document before each of you. This is not a threat, it's a statement of record. Whatever decisions are made in this room today will be made in that context." She said it the way she said everything without drama, as a simple fact. One of Malcolm's directors, the heavy-set man who had studied Rowan near the door, put his copy of the document down and looked at Malcolm. It was a small gesture, and it said everything. Malcolm said, "Celeste, what you've assembled here is my evidence," she said. "A selective interpretation of financial data that, taken out of context. The shell companies are not a matter of interpretation, Malcolm. They exist. The payments exist. The short position against this company's stock exists. Hargrove Capital Partners exists. The connection between Hargrove's principals and the individuals who will benefit from this company's collapse." She put one more page on the screen. "That exists too." The room looked at the screen. The 2 names Lenora had found on Hargrove's registration documents were there, with the connections mapped cleanly beneath them. 2 men who existed in the same financial ecosystem as Waverly Dominion's board, who had been positioned at a careful distance from any obvious conflict of interest, who had built a structure designed to look like nothing while doing something worth $100 million. Sandra Chu said quietly and carefully, "Malcolm, is this accurate?" Malcolm did not answer immediately. He was looking at the screen, and what was happening behind his face was not visible, but whatever it was significant. He was a man who had spent 3 years building something and was watching it come apart, not in a regulatory investigation or a courtroom which he might have been able to manage, with lawyers and delays and procedural complexity, but in a glass-walled boardroom at 8 in the morning in front of the people whose opinion of him had previously constituted his professional life. "I have counsel," he said finally. "I'm not going to respond to these allegations without counsel present." "That's your right," Lenora said. "And it's noted." Victor Osi said, "I'd like to move that Malcolm Vane be placed on immediate administrative suspension pending investigation." "Do I have a second?" "Seconded," said Sandra Chu, before the sentence was completely finished. Malcolm's 4 directors sat in a configuration of choices they had not been prepared to make. 3 of them, Rowan thought, had probably told themselves that what they were doing was complicated enough that it existed in a gray area, that they were participating in a restructuring, not a fraud, that the distinction existed somewhere in the details. The details were now on the screen in front of them, and the gray area had closed. The heavyset man said, "I'll support the motion." It went through. Malcolm stood. He looked at Celeste not with anger, which was what Rowan had expected, but with something more complicated. The expression of a man who had underestimated someone for 6 years, and was only now, fully and finally, understanding the extent of his miscalculation. "You knew," he said. "You've known for months." "I had fragments," she said. "I didn't have the whole picture until last night. You gave me the last piece when you sent 8 men into the parking garage." He was quiet for a moment. "The driver," he said, and he looked at Rowan for the 3rd time that morning. And this time the look had the quality of a man trying to understand a variable that he had failed to account for and would not get another opportunity to fix. "I should have known better." "Yes," Rowan said from the wall. "You should have." Malcolm gathered his things. Building security Hendricks and Park, who had been stationed on this floor, per Celeste's instructions, appeared at the door with the timing that suggested Marcus had been monitoring the meeting from outside and had called them at the right moment. They were professional about it. Malcolm walked out between them without a further scene, which Rowan suspected was less about dignity and more about the calculation that a scene would generate additional evidence. The boardroom was quiet after he left. Margaret Ellison, who had said almost nothing during the entire proceeding, looked at Celeste and said, "You should have called me 3 months ago." "I know," Celeste said. "I'm sorry, Margaret. Don't be sorry. Just don't make me find out about the next crisis on medical leave." Victor Osi let out a long breath. "What happens now?" "The acquisition. The acquisition is suspended pending a full audit," Celeste said. "Everything Malcolm's team touched gets reviewed from the beginning. That will take time, and it will cost us some of what we've built toward this deal, and it is what it is." She paused. "The company is intact. The structure is intact. We've lost time, and we've lost the assumption that the people closest to us are acting in our interest, and neither of those things is small. But we still have the company." Sandra Chu said quietly, "How long have you been dealing with this alone?" Celeste was quiet for a moment. "Long enough." The directors began the work of the meeting, the real work. Not the engineered version Malcolm had prepared, but the actual governance that had narrowly survived an attempt to hollow it out from the inside. Motions were made, seconded, recorded. Lenora sat at the table and handled the legal dimensions with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for exactly this contingency since 3 in the morning. Margaret, despite her 6 weeks away, was sharp on every procedural point, which told Rowan something about the quality of people Celeste had originally put around herself before Malcolm had spent years quietly trying to shift the composition of the board. Rowan stood near the wall. At one point, mid-morning, Marcus came in with coffee and a plate of something that was nominally food, small sandwiches, the kind catering sends up for long meetings, and Rowan accepted a cup and a sandwich and ate standing up, which was not ideal, but was adequate. And adequate was something he had a great deal of practice with. Margaret Ellison caught his eye at one point from across the table. She had been watching him with the intermittent attention of someone who is curious but not ready to satisfy the curiosity yet. When their eyes met, she tilted her head slightly, a question without words. He gave her the small nod of someone who has done what needed doing and has no interest in discussing it further. She seemed satisfied with that. The meeting ran until 11:20. By the time the last motion was recorded and the last director had filed out, Rowan's back had developed the specific complaint that comes from 2 hours of standing in one position. His coffee had been refilled 3 times by the quietly attentive Marcus, and the city outside the glass walls had moved fully into the bright, washed morning that follows a heavy rain. Celeste sat at the head of the empty table after everyone else had left. Lenora was packing her rolling case. Rowan stayed where he was. Margaret had been the last director to leave, and she had stopped at the door and put a hand briefly on Celeste's shoulder, no words. Just that, and then she was gone. For a moment, the only sounds in the room were the distant muted sounds of the city, 42 floors below, and Lenora's case being organized with systematic efficiency. "It's not over," Celeste said. It wasn't a complaint. It was just an accurate observation, stated without the energy to dress it up. "No," Lenora agreed. "The federal investigation will take months. There will be civil suits. The acquisition renegotiation will drag. You will need to rebuild the trust of directors you're not certain about yet, replace the ones who are suspended, and run this company through all of that simultaneously." She zipped the case. "It is not over. But the part where they win is over." Celeste looked at the table. "The part where they win is over," she repeated, and something in the repetition suggested she was testing whether it felt real. Lenora came around the table and put a hand on her arm briefly. "Go home, Celeste. Sleep. I'll handle the next 12 hours. She picked up her case. "That's what you pay me for." She left. In the empty boardroom, with the city spread out behind glass walls, Celeste sat, and Rosen stood, and the morning continued without asking either of them what they needed. After a while, Celeste said, "You stood against that wall for 4 hours. 3.5. Your back must be killing you. It's manageable." She turned in the chair to look at him fully. She looked very tired, not defeated. Nothing like defeated, but the specific tiredness of someone who has carried a weight at a sprint for a long time and has just been allowed, for the first time, to put it down. She also looked under the tiredness, like herself, which was to say clear-eyed, direct, and thinking about the next thing even while processing the current one. "I need to ask you something," she said. "All right. And I need you to answer me honestly, not professionally." "Those are usually the same thing for me," he said. "Last night in the cab, I told you about Petra Solis and the folder she left on my desk. And you asked all the right questions, in the right order, faster than my attorney would have." She held his gaze. "Did you know something was wrong before we pulled into that garage?" He thought about this honestly, because she'd asked for honesty. "I noticed things," he said, "over 11 days, irregular patterns in the people around you. The way certain conversations stopped when I came near. The specific timing of Malcolm's calls on days when I picked you up. I didn't know what it meant. I wasn't looking for anything. But I file things it's a hard habit to break. And last night, when we pulled into the garage and the configuration of those vehicles was wrong, the things I'd filed over 11 days snapped into a different shape." She was quiet. "I should have said something earlier," he said. "I didn't, because I had no specific information and it wasn't my business and I'm a chauffeur." Which was, I think I was telling myself the job description limited what I was allowed to notice. "It didn't. No, it didn't." He paused. "I'm sorry for that." She shook her head. "Don't apologize. You got me out of the garage. You stood against that wall for 3.5 hours. You gave me your phone and your cash and navigated us through half of Manhattan at midnight." A pause. "I think we're probably even." He almost said something and didn't, and she watched him not say it. "What?" she said. "Nothing worth Rowan." He looked at her. "You asked last night why I'd never found something to be after Tessa. What I do that isn't just surviving." He stopped. This was not the kind of thing he said out loud, generally. He said it out loud now because she'd asked for honesty and she'd meant it, and there was something in the quality of her attention that made evasion feel like the wrong choice. "Last night was the first time in 5 years that I used what I actually am in a way that mattered to someone other than Tessa. And I'm not sure what to do with that." The city hummed 42 floors below them. Celeste held his gaze for a long moment, and she didn't say anything immediately, which told him she was taking the statement seriously, rather than offering him a reflexive reassurance. "I think," she said finally, "that's worth sitting with for a while." "Yes," he said. "And I think," she added more slowly, "that I would be a very poor judge of character if I let what you did last night end, with you going back to picking up executives at airports." He looked at her. "That's not a conversation for today," she said. "Today is for going home and sleeping." She stood, gathered her materials, and looked at him with the directness that was simply how she saw the world. But it's a conversation worth having. She moved toward the door. He followed, because that was still his job, and also because it was simply the right direction to go. In the elevator on the way down, Celeste looked at her own reflection in the polished door's wrinkled blazer, pulled back hair, 11 hours of a very difficult night, written somewhere in the set of her face, and said, almost to herself, I need to call Tessa's school. Rowan looked at her. I want to make sure she gets home all right today. Celeste caught his eyes in the reflection. She should be with her father tonight. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said, she should. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. The morning was waiting bright and cold and indifferent, the way mornings are when the world doesn't know what has just happened inside a glass-walled building 42 floors up. Celeste Waverly walked out into it. Rowan Mercer walked beside her. The part where they win was over. Everything else was just beginning. The first thing Rowan did when he got home was stand in the kitchen for approximately 4 minutes without doing anything. He wasn't thinking exactly. He wasn't processing exactly. He was doing the thing that happens when a body that has been running on adrenaline and purpose and forward momentum is suddenly given permission to stop, and the stopping takes a moment to become real. The apartment was quiet. Morning light came through the window over the sink, in that particular way it does in late autumn, low and long and making ordinary things look briefly significant. There was a cereal bowl in the drying rack that Tessa had washed imperfectly, with a dried ring of milk near the rim that she'd missed. There was a permission slip on the counter with a sticky note that said, Dad, don't forget, in her handwriting, which used 3 exclamation points for most things she considered important. He stood there, and then he washed the bowl properly, and then he went to sleep. He slept for 6 hours without dreaming, which was not always how it went, but was how it went that day. And when he woke up, the permission slip was gone, and Tessa was home from school and sitting at the kitchen table doing homework with her shoes still on, which was a house rule she violated consistently and without apparent awareness. Dad. She looked up. You look terrible. Thank you. Helen said you had a complicated work night. I did. He sat down across from her and looked at the homework math, fractions, the kind of problem that had seemed important once and now existed in a category of things the world had scaled correctly. How was school? Boring. We're doing the American Revolution again, even though we did it in 3rd grade. I told Mr. Patterson we already covered this, and he said 4th grade goes deeper, and I said how much deeper can it go, and he gave me a look. The look? The look. She drew a circle on her paper. I didn't say anything else. Good call. I know. She erased something. Are you okay? He looked at his daughter, 9 years old, entirely serious, wearing a sweater with a small paint stain on the cuff that had survived 12 washes because she'd gotten it doing an art project she was proud of, and he hadn't pushed the issue. She had her mother's eyes, which was something he knew from photographs rather than memory, and she had his particular quality of asking direct questions and meaning them. I'm okay, he said. It was a hard night, but it's done. Did someone get hurt? He thought about the guard in the garage, the man who'd grabbed his arm and ended up on the concrete floor. He'd been conscious when they left. Bruised. Probably angry. Not seriously hurt. Not badly, he said, which was true enough. Tessa looked at him for a moment longer, doing her own filing, and then she returned to fractions. Helen made extra pasta. It's in the fridge. Of course it is. She also said to tell you that if you're going to do complicated work nights, you should at least have a better phone. She couldn't reach you. I know. I'll get a new one this week. She left her landline number on the fridge in case. He looked at the fridge. There was indeed a post-it note with Helen's landline number, written in her careful, elderly cursive. He'd known Helen Mura for 5 years and had never once called her on a landline. He was obscurely moved by this. Tell her thank you, he said. I did already. Tessa flipped her worksheet over to the back. Dad, the job with the lady. Is it still happening? What do you mean? I mean, are you still working for her? Because you said it was temporary and maybe you'd have a different assignment soon, but you were kind of weird about it when you said it, so. I'm asking. He thought about the boardroom that morning, about the conversation in the elevator, about Celeste's reflection in the polished doors saying I would be a very poor judge of character if I let what you did last night end, with you going back to picking up executives at airports. I don't know yet, he said honestly. Something might change. We'll see. Tessa accepted this with the equanimity she reserved for uncertain situations, which was part of what made her, at 9, already a more sophisticated handler of ambiguity than most adults he'd known. She'd grown up in a household where we'll see was a real answer and not a deflection, and she'd learned to hear the difference. He heated up Helen's pasta and ate it at the counter, and Tessa finished her homework, and the evening went on in its ordinary way. He was grateful for every unremarkable minute of it. The complications began the next morning. The first complication was the story. It broke in the financial press at 6:47 a.m. The suspension of Malcolm Vane from Waverly Dominion, pending a federal investigation into alleged securities fraud and corporate governance violations. By 7:30, it had been picked up by 3 major outlets. By 9, it was being discussed on financial news channels with the particular feverish quality that attaches to stories involving billionaires and betrayal, which are the 2 things financial media loves most when they appear together. Rowan watched a brief segment on his phone over coffee, deliberately brief, because the coverage was heavy on speculation and light on accuracy, as it always was in the first 48 hours of something like this, and then put his phone face down on the table. His own phone, now. He'd bought a new one the previous afternoon, a basic model that didn't make him feel like he was compensating for anything, and transferred what little he needed transferred. The borrowed prepaid was in a drawer. He'd return it to Celeste at some point when the moment was right. He was still figuring out what at some point meant, and whether there was going to be an at some point that wasn't awkward. The second complication arrived at 9:15, in the form of a call from the Executive Chauffeur Services Operations Manager, a practical man named Gerald, who communicated exclusively through the direct statement of logistical facts, and whom Rowan had always found this quality professionally refreshing. "Mercer," Gerald said, "Waverly account has requested you specifically for the next 2 weeks. Daily availability, variable hours, higher than standard rate. That's direct from the client." Rowan was quiet for a moment. Did they give a reason? Clients at that tier don't typically give reasons. But the account manager mentioned Ms. Waverly said something about preferring continuity. A pause. "You had a complicated assignment last night, apparently. It was manageable." "Right." Gerald's tone was the tone of a man who had read the morning's financial news and had drawn certain inferences that he was professionally not going to voice. "You're available?" He thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved, which was not long.
Yes.
"Good. She's requested a 10 a.m. pickup, her headquarters building." He was there at 9:52, which was 8 minutes early, which was how he did things. The lobby of Waverly Dominion's headquarters had a different quality than it had 11 days ago, when he'd first come to pick up an executive he'd barely registered as a person. The security staff at the desk were the same Hendricks, the taller one, who nodded at him with the brief recognition of someone who'd been positioned on a floor during a significant event and remembered who'd been there. The building itself was unchanged. What was different was the weight in the air, the particular atmospheric quality of an institution that has just been through something and is still deciding what it means. Marcus met him at the elevator. "She's running about 10 minutes behind. There was a call from the U.S. Attorney's Office." "That's fine." Marcus looked at him with the assessing expression of someone who was updating a category. In the previous 11 days, Marcus had interacted with Rowan approximately the way you interact with hired transportation professionally, briefly, and without curiosity. That had shifted. "Can I get you anything while you wait?" "I'm good. Thank you." He waited in the lobby, and he watched the building do its morning people, moving through with coffee cups and the specific purposeful stride of an organization that has had a significant disruption and is collectively deciding to keep functioning anyway. There was something in that he respected. Companies took on the character of the people who ran them, and what he was seeing in Waverly Dominion's lobby at 10 in the morning, 3 days after its CFO had been suspended, pending federal investigation, was a building that was continuing to work, which said something about the woman on the 42nd floor. Celeste came out of the elevator at 10:13. She was in a different configuration than she'd been in. For the past 11 days, the executive presentation was the same, the tailored clothes and the composure, but something in the way she held herself was fractionally different. Less performance in it. She looked, Rowan thought, like someone who had recently set down a thing she'd been carrying alone for too long, and was still adjusting to the absence of the weight. She saw him and said, "You got a new phone. Mine didn't survive the night. I'll reimburse you." "That's not necessary. I know it's not necessary," she said, with a quality in her voice that was approximately 5% exasperated and 95% something warmer. "I'm going to do it anyway." She walked toward the exit. "I need to get to Lenora's office. There's a 2 o'clock with the SEC after that." And I'm expected at the printer for the press statement by noon, which I've been rewriting since 6 this morning because the first 4 versions were terrible. How's the 5th? Almost terrible. She pushed through the glass door into the November morning. Progress. He held the car door. She got in. He drove. It was the most normal sequence of events that had occurred in 11 days, and the normalcy of it was doing something strange to him that he couldn't quite name. What followed over the next 2 weeks was the complicated, unglamorous, often grinding work of aftermath, and it was nothing like what people who haven't been through institutional crises imagine it to be. The federal investigation did not move with dramatic speed. The civil legal process did not resolve itself. The board restructuring required meetings that generated more meetings that generated documentation that required review, and Celeste was in the middle of all of it simultaneously, managing a billion-dollar enterprise while also managing the process of dismantling the structure that had almost stolen it from her. Rowan drove her to most of it. He waited in lobbies. He drank a great deal of variable quality coffee in a great variety of institutional waiting areas. He drove her back. Occasionally she talked during the drive, not always about work, and this shift had happened gradually and without announcement, the way most significant shifts happen. On a Tuesday evening, heading back from a meeting in Lower Manhattan, she told him about the pitch deck she'd built at 23, not the elevator version she'd given him in the cab weeks ago, but the real version, with the parts that had gone wrong, and the night she'd almost quit, and the specific investor meeting, where she'd said exactly the wrong thing to exactly the wrong person, and had recovered it through what she could only describe as stubbornness, because there wasn't a more flattering word. On a Thursday afternoon, she asked him about Tessa's school, not in the polite way, but with specific follow-up questions that indicated she'd remembered the previous answers. On a Friday morning, stuck in traffic on the FDR, she said out of nowhere, "Do you regret not staying in?" The seals. He thought about it. "No. I regret the timing. I would have liked to have left on my own terms, when it made sense rather than when it became the only option. But the decision itself, no. What would you have done if you'd had the choice?" "Something like this," he said, and then was quiet for a moment, because he hadn't known he was going to say that until he did, and the saying of it made it true in a way the thinking of it hadn't. Celeste was quiet, too, and he could feel the weight of the thing she wasn't saying yet, and he was reasonably certain he knew what it was, and he was not sure how he felt about it. The 3rd week, she said it. They were parked outside Lenora's building, the same building they'd arrived at together at 11 o'clock on a rainy Wednesday night 3 weeks ago, waiting for Lenora to finish a call. The engine was running. The heat was on. It was the first truly cold day of the season, the kind that makes Manhattan feel skeletal and honest. "I want to talk to you about something," Celeste said. "All right. I've been restructuring the company, which you know you've driven me to most of it." She had a folder on her lap, which was unusual. She normally worked from screens. "I'm creating a new position. Director of Corporate Security and Strategic Operations. The remit is broad physical security, internal risk assessment, strategic consultation on sensitive deals and personnel decisions, oversight of the background process that should have caught what Malcolm was doing years before it got to where it did." She paused. "I want to offer it to you." He didn't say anything immediately. "The compensation is significant," she said. "The role is permanent. You'd have an office on 38, a team of 4 to start that you'd have input in selecting, and direct access to me on anything that requires it." She opened the folder and set it on the console between them. "The terms are written out. Take whatever time you need to look at them." He looked at the folder but didn't pick it up. "What's the condition?" She looked at him. "What? You said a condition in your head when you said that. I could hear it." She held his gaze for a moment. "Tessa always comes first," she said. "That's the condition. It's written into the arrangement not as a courtesy, as a term. School events, emergencies, her schedule, those take precedence over mine. If I call you at 6 p.m. for something non-critical and you're at a school play, I wait until after the play. That's not negotiable." He was quiet. "I'm not offering you a job that costs you your daughter," she said. "I'm offering you a job that uses what you are, without requiring you to give up what matters more." The heat ran. Outside, a gust moved a handful of dry leaves across the pavement. "Why?" he said. Not accusatorily, genuinely. She thought about it. "Because in 12 years of running this company, I have never had someone in my professional life who I could be confident was acting entirely in my interest without also acting in their own first. Lenora comes close, but Lenora has her own firm and her own clients, and that's appropriate and correct." She paused. What you did in that garage, you didn't do it because I could do something for you. You did it because it was wrong not to. That is extraordinarily rare, and I am not going to pretend otherwise." He was quiet for a while. "I left the SEALs because I decided Tessa's childhood wasn't a resource I was willing to spend on another mission," he said. "That decision was right. I know it was right. Yes. The last 3 weeks I've been thinking about what you said in the boardroom. About being a poor judge of character if you let it end there." He looked at his hands on the wheel. "I've been thinking about what Tessa would say if I told her about the offer. What would she say? She'd say take it." He said it with the particular mix of affection and helplessness that characterized his relationship with his daughter's wisdom. "She's 9. She's also usually right." A pause. She'd ask one question first. "What question?" She'd ask if the person making the offer was someone worth working for. He looked at Celeste. "I've had 3 weeks of daily proximity to answer that question." "And?" "Yes," he said. "She is." Something shifted in Celeste's face, not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical quality that the moment might have warranted in a different kind of story. It was quieter than that. The specific expression of someone who has been alone with something difficult for a long time and has just been told they don't have to be. "I need a week," he said, "to think about it properly and talk to Tessa." "Take 2, she said. He nodded. She took the folder back and closed it, and a moment later Lenora came out of the building, and he got out to open the door, and the afternoon resumed its particular demands. But something had changed, and they both knew it, and neither of them needed to say so. He talked to Tessa that evening. He told her the full version, not the version he'd been giving her in installments, the complicated work night and the something might change, but the actual story, stripped down to what a 9-year-old needed to understand it. The garage, the documents, the boardroom, what had been at stake and what had happened to it. Tessa listened with the focused intensity she brought to things she decided were important, and she didn't interrupt, which was not her default, but was the mode she shifted into when she was taking something seriously. When he finished, she said, "The bad guy thought you were just the driver." "Yes, that's a mistake. It was." She thought for a while. "Is she nice?" "The lady. Yes. She's not always easy. But she's honest and she works hard, and she means what she says. That combination's harder to find than it sounds." Tessa nodded slowly. "Does the job mean you'd be homeless?" He had thought about this carefully, because it was the question that mattered. More predictably, he said, "Right now my hours are variable, and sometimes I have to leave on short notice for long stretches. This would be more structured. Some evenings would be long, but you'd know about them in advance. And Miss Waverly knows I come first. It's in writing." Tessa processed this with the seriousness of a small person who has learned to take the terms of arrangements seriously because the arrangements shape the life. "Okay," she said finally, "I think you should do it." "Yeah? You've been doing quiet for 5 years, Dad. You're not actually a quiet person." He stared at her. "You're a calm person," she said, with the air of someone making a very precise distinction. "Those are different. Quiet people like being in the background. You just learned to be in the background because it was safer." She picked up her homework. "That's not the same thing." He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "When did you get this smart?" "I've always been this smart," she said. "You're just paying attention." He called Celeste the next morning. Not with an answer yet, he'd said a week. And he meant a week, because decisions made in the first 24 hours of emotional clarity tended to have rough edges that a week's worth of honest consideration would smooth or reveal, but to ask a question he should have asked in the car. She answered on the second ring. "The 4 people I'd be selecting for the team," he said. "Do I have actual authority there, or approval authority?" A brief pause. "Actual authority. Final say is yours. I'd want visibility into the choices, but it's your team. And the scope of the risk assessment remit, does that include internal personnel or only external threats?" "Both. That's the point. What Malcolm built could have been caught by a competent internal risk function 2 years ago. It wasn't, because Malcolm controlled the function. The new structure is separate from executive influence by design." He nodded, though she couldn't see it. "One more question." "Go ahead." "The original acquisition, the one Malcolm used as his mechanism, is it completely dead, or is there a version of it that makes sense without the corruption built into it?" A longer pause. "That's an interesting question. It's a strategic asset question. If the underlying acquisition had value before Malcolm engineered it into a weapon, and the counterparty is cleanly separated from Hargrove's people, there might be a renegotiated version worth considering. I've been thinking about that." she said, quietly. I didn't want to raise it until the investigation was further along. But you have been thinking about it. Yes. Then that's something we can look at. When it's time. Another pause. You said we. I'm giving you an answer in 6 days, he said. I'm saying we in the meantime. He could hear something in the silence that followed, that he chose not to examine too carefully, because it was early days and he was a careful person, and some things needed to develop at the pace they needed to develop. 6 days, she said. 6 days. The 6 days were not without incident. The financial press coverage intensified in the middle of the week when 2 of Hargrove Capital Partners' principals were named in the SEC filing names that connected to other names, which connected to other entities, which began to suggest that what Malcolm Vane had built for Waverly Dominion was not the first version of this particular scheme. There were 2 other companies in other sectors where similar structures appeared, under investigation now by extension. The story had grown past the story of Celeste's company and into something larger, which was not what she'd intended when she walked into that boardroom, but was the direct consequence of the evidence Lenora had assembled and the calls she'd made. Celeste handled this with the same quality she'd handled everything, without drama, with forward-facing pragmatism, and with the specific tiredness of someone who has accepted that a situation is what it is and is working within it rather than against it. On day 4, she called Rowan about something that wasn't work. Margaret Ellison wants to meet you, she said. She asked me to ask if you'd be willing to have coffee with her. He was surprised, which was not a state he entered often. Why? She said she watched you stand against that wall for 4 hours, and she wants to know who does that. A brief pause that sounded like it contained amusement. I told her the honest answer was a former Navy SEAL who doesn't know how to turn it off, and she said that was interesting, but she wanted to hear the rest. The rest. The part where the man and the operator are the same person. Her words. He thought about this. Tell her yes. The coffee with Margaret happened on day 5, at a small place near her apartment building that she'd clearly been going to for years, based on the way the staff treated her. She was still moving carefully. The back surgery had left residual discomfort she managed without complaining about it, and she had the particular quality of someone who has decided that age is a fact and not an insult and is proceeding accordingly. She asked him questions, good ones, not about the garage or the boardroom, but about Dana, and about what it had actually cost him to leave the SEALs, and about what he'd lost in the years of adequate her word, which told him Celeste had talked to her about their conversations in a way that he would need to process later. She listened to his answers with the complete attention of someone who has been on enough boards and in enough rooms to know the difference between an answer and a performance. At the end of the coffee, she said, Celeste has been alone in that company for 6 years, in a way she hasn't let most people see. I've watched it. I haven't been able to fix it because it's not the kind of thing that gets fixed by observation. She wrapped both hands around her cup. She needs people who are in her corner because they've decided to be, not because it serves them to appear that way. Those people are rare. I know, he said. You're going to take the position. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, he said. She nodded, satisfied, and finished her coffee. On the 6th day, he called Celeste. Yes, he said when she answered. A pause. Then okay. The team selections, I want to start with a conversation about criteria before we look at candidates. Monday works. Monday, he agreed. He was quiet for a moment, and she was quiet. And in the quiet was the particular quality of 2 people who have been through something together and are now beginning the different, longer thing on the other side of it. Rowan, she said. Yeah, thank you for the yes. He thought about Tessa at the kitchen table, telling him the difference between quiet and calm. He thought about Dana's photograph on the shelf in the hallway, the one Tessa sometimes talked to when she thought it wasn't listening, which he had always pretended not to notice because it seemed like the right thing to pretend. He thought about a parking garage in the rain and a narrow service corridor, and the particular moment when a woman he barely knew had said, all right, and trusted him with 3 minutes. Don't thank me yet, he said. I haven't done anything. You already did, she said. The rest is just the work. He found, standing in his kitchen on a cold November morning with a new phone and a bowl that had been properly washed and a permission slip successfully signed and returned, that he had no argument for that. The work was about to begin, and for the first time in a very long time, he was ready for it. The work was not clean, and it was not fast, and anyone who has ever tried to rebuild something from the inside while it was still running knows that the process has a particular kind of exhaustion that rest doesn't fully address. You sleep, and you wake up, and the thing is still there, still requiring the next decision, still asking more of you than you fully have on any given day. That was December for Celeste Waverly. The federal investigation moved the way federal investigations move, with the grinding, methodical pace of an institution that has learned, through long experience, that speed produces errors and errors produce appeals, and appeals produce the specific bureaucratic nightmare of doing the same work twice. The SEC opened a formal inquiry. The U.S. Attorney's Office assigned 2 prosecutors to the case. Hargrove Capital Partners' accounts were frozen pending review, which had the immediate effect of collapsing the short position against Waverly Dominion stock. The position simply ceased to be executable when the capital behind it became legally inaccessible, and the stock, which had been under pressure from the uncertainty of the past weeks, stabilized, and then began a slow recovery that the financial press attributed to various market factors rather than the more accurate explanation, which was that the mechanism designed to destroy the company had been disassembled before it could run. Malcolm Vane retained counsel, 3 of them, in fact, which was the number you retained when you understood the depth of what you were facing and said nothing publicly. The 2 principals of Hargrove Capital Partners retained their own counsel, and issued a statement through their attorneys that was 18 paragraphs of dense legal language adding up to the assertion that they had done nothing wrong, which was the statement you issued when you had done several things wrong and were hoping the evidence was less comprehensive than it turned out to be. It was comprehensive. Lenora had made certain of that. The 4 compromised directors were suspended pending their own legal exposure assessments. One of them not the heavy-set man who had looked at Rowan near the boardroom door, but a woman named Claire Holt, who had been on the board for 3 years, and who Celeste had genuinely liked, retained separate counsel from Malcolm's group, and began a process of cooperation with the investigators that would eventually result in a significantly reduced personal liability. Celeste learned about this from Lenora and said nothing about it for a long time, and then one evening in the car on the way back from a late meeting, she said, "I keep thinking about Claire." And Rowan waited, and she said, "I don't know if I'm angrier at her for what she did or more sad for her that she thought it was worth doing." "Those aren't mutually exclusive," he said. "No," she said. "They're not." And she was quiet for the rest of the drive, which was not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the silence of someone sitting with something difficult and choosing not to rush it. He had learned by December to hear the differences in her silences. This was not information he had sought, it had simply accumulated over the daily proximity of the work, the way knowledge accumulates when you pay attention to things without agenda. He knew that the silence after a meeting that had gone well was lighter than the silence after a meeting that hadn't, and that she used the drive to decompress rather than to discuss, and that occasionally she would shift from decompression into something more conversational, without warning and without apology, expecting him to follow the transition. He always could. He wasn't sure what that meant, and had decided provisionally to accept it as a fact without over-examining it. His first month as Director of Corporate Security and Strategic Operations was less dramatic than the night that had produced the title. It was mostly process, building the internal framework that should have existed before, developing the protocols that would have caught what Malcolm had done if they'd been in place, interviewing candidates for the 4 team positions with the specific eye of someone who knew the difference between people who were competent and people who were competent and honest, which was a smaller overlap than most organizations wanted to acknowledge. He hired a former federal financial crimes analyst named Dana Vasquez, who had left the government after 12 years because she was tired of the bureaucracy, but not tired of the work. He hired a corporate intelligence specialist named Tom Okafor, who had spent 8 years working for a private firm that handled sensitive investigations for financial institutions, and who had the additional quality of being genuinely unimpressed by the scale of the names involved, which Rowan found professionally valuable. The other 2 positions he filled more slowly, because slow was right for those particular roles, and he had the authority to take the time. He had his own office on the 38th floor, as promised. It was a reasonable size, not large, not symbolic, functional with 1 window, and a desk that had belonged to someone else before him and would belong to someone else after. He liked it because of what it was not. It was not a car. It was not a waiting room. It was not the specific kind of provisional space that says you are here temporarily, and that is understood by all parties. He was here in a way that had a future tense, and the novelty of that had not yet worn off. Tessa approved of the office, which she informed him about at dinner one evening, after he'd shown her a photograph. "It looks like you," she said. "It looks like an office." "That's what I said." She speared a piece of broccoli. "Does Miss Waverly have a nicer one?" "Significantly." "Good, she's the boss." She chewed. "Is she a good boss?" He thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. She's honest about what she expects. She doesn't change what she expects without telling you. When she's wrong about something, she says so. He paused. "She's not always easy. You said that before." "It's still true." Tessa nodded, satisfied with the consistency of his reporting. "I want to meet her." "That's not really Dad. You work with her every day. You talk about her like she's a real person. I want to know if she actually is." He didn't have a good argument for this, which was itself informative. The meeting happened in January, and it happened in the most ordinary way possible. Celeste was working a Saturday at the office because the acquisition renegotiation had entered a critical phase, and the counterparty's team was only available weekends due to time zone considerations, and Rowan had a conflict with Tessa's Saturday arrangements and had mentioned it, and Celeste had said, without any particular ceremony, "Bring her in. She can use the conference room down the hall. There's a whiteboard and Wi-Fi. She'll be fine." Tessa was not, as it turned out, in the conference room for more than 20 minutes before she appeared in the doorway of Celeste's office, which was technically not where she was supposed to be, but Celeste's door had been open, and Tessa had formed the view that an open door was an invitation, which was a reading of social conventions that was not entirely wrong. Rowan was in a meeting in the adjacent conference room when Marcus appeared at the door with the expression of someone delivering news they're not sure how to categorize and said, "Your daughter is talking to Ms. Waverly." He went to the doorway. Tessa was sitting in the chair across from Celeste's desk, not perched nervously, but settled. In the way she settled into chair when she had decided a situation was interesting, and Celeste was leaning forward with her elbows on the desk, and they were talking with the ease of people who have found an unexpected frequency in common. He stood in the doorway and listened. "The fractions are fine," Tessa was saying. "It's the word problems I don't like. They're always about things nobody actually needs to know. If Sarah has 14 apples and gives away 6, nobody cares how many Sarah has. Sarah should not have bought so many apples." Celeste said completely seriously, "That's a fair critique of the genre. My dad says math is just logic with numbers." "Your dad is right." "He's right about most things," Tessa said, in the tone of someone offering a fair assessment rather than a compliment. "Not everything. He thought the new Italian place on our block was too expensive without trying it first. It was not too expensive." "How was it?" "Really good. We went for my birthday." A pause. He felt bad about being wrong. "He seems like the type," Celeste said. "He really is." Tessa looked around the office with frank curiosity. "This is a big office." "It is. Do you like it?" Celeste appeared to consider this genuinely. "Sometimes. When it's quiet and I can think. Not always when it isn't." She tilted her head. "Do you think your dad likes his office?" "I think he likes that it's his," Tessa said. "He hasn't had a lot of things that were just his for a while." In the doorway, Rowan experienced a specific kind of feeling for which he didn't have a clean name, something in the territory between gratitude and the particular ache of being seen accurately by someone who loves you without complication. Celeste looked up and caught him standing there. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. Tessa, who had followed Celeste's gaze, said, "How long have you been there?" "A minute." "You should announce yourself." "I was listening." "To what?" "Something worth listening to." Tessa appeared to process whether this was a satisfying answer, decided it was acceptable, and turned back to Celeste. "He does that," she said. "The listening thing. He's very good at it." "I know," Celeste said. After that, the Saturday office visits became an occasional thing, not regular, not scheduled, but an option that existed and was sometimes exercised, and Tessa moved through Waverly Dominion's 38th and 42nd floors with the comfortable ease of someone who has been told she belongs in a space and has decided to believe it. She brought homework. She ate the catering sandwiches Marxists sent up with the discriminating judgment of a 9-year-old who had been told to eat something reasonable before the good snacks. She informed Dana Vasquez, who had the desk nearest the elevator on 38, that her plant needed more water, which was accurate, and which Dina acknowledged with the straightforward appreciation of someone who prefers direct information to polite silence. She told Celeste once, in late January, that her office needed something on the wall. Celeste looked at the walls, clean, neutral, professional, and said, "What would you put there?" Tessa thought about it. "Something that's yours. Not like a company thing. Something that means something to you personally." Celeste was quiet for a moment. "I'll think about it." The wall remained bare for another 3 weeks, and then one morning Rowan arrived to find a framed photograph on the wall. Beside the window, a city taken from street level, slightly blurred in the way photographs taken in a hurry are blurred. Nothing technically impressive about it, but the angle was specific, and the light was particular, and it had clearly been taken by someone who looked at that corner of that street at that moment and thought, that's worth keeping. He didn't ask about it. He didn't need to. February brought the first resolution. The U.S. Attorney's Office filed charges against Malcolm Vane on 7 counts, including securities fraud, conspiracy, and corporate theft. The charges against Hargrove Capital Partners, 2 principals, were filed the same week, 9 counts between them, including the charges related to the short position scheme and its connection to the attempt to seize control of Waverly Dominion. The financial press covered it heavily for 3 days and then moved on to the next thing, which is the nature of financial press coverage and was, in its way, a relief. Celeste read the filing documents at her desk on a Tuesday afternoon and did not celebrate, which was the right response, and also entirely consistent with who she was. She read them the way she read everything completely and without skimming, and when she was done, she set them aside and went back to the acquisition renegotiation, which was the work that was actually in front of her and needed to be done. Rowan came to her office at the end of that day with a logistics question about a board-related security protocol, which was the reason he'd come, and then he saw her face and said, "You read the filing." "Yes. How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly, which was what she did. Like something that should have happened a long time ago finally happened. And also like it doesn't fully fix the thing that got broken, which is that's just reality. The filing doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means there are consequences. She paused. "I keep thinking about Petrosolis." Rowan waited. She knew, Celeste said. She walked into that company, she figured out what Malcolm was building, and she left a piece of paper on my desk with an account number and a company name, and then she disappeared. She could have gone to the authorities. She could have come to me directly. Instead, she left me a breadcrumb and got herself out. A pause. "I've been trying to find her. Any luck?" "Lenora found a current address in Portland last week. I sent a letter." She looked at the window. "I don't know what I'll say exactly. Thank you seems both right and insufficient." She took a risk leaving that paper, even anonymously. She did it anyway, a longer pause. People do things like that. Small, courageous things that nobody sees and nobody records. And sometimes those things are the difference. He thought about Dana, who had raised herself for stretches of years while he was deployed, who had managed her own illness for months before telling him because she hadn't wanted to pull him from his unit, who had arranged her own affairs with a care and a quiet dignity that he had not fully understood until he was sorting through them afterward. Small, courageous things. The kind that don't look like courage from the outside because they don't announce themselves. "Yes," he said, "they are." Celeste looked at him, and in the look was the particular quality of 2 people who have arrived at the same place from different directions and recognized the territory without needing to map it out loud. "The logistics question," she said. "It can wait until tomorrow." "Go home, Rowan." "Yeah," he said, "I will." March came in cold and stayed cold longer than it should have, the way March does in New York every 3rd year or so, as though the city is being reminded that winter doesn't negotiate. The acquisition renegotiation reached its final phase, a genuinely renegotiated version of the original deal, stripped of the engineered vulnerability Malcolm had built into it, restructured by a team that now included Rowan's risk assessment on every significant clause, which was the kind of review that would have caught the original manipulation in 15 minutes if it had existed then. It had not existed then. It existed now. The counterparty, a technology infrastructure company whose principals had been cleanly separated from Hargrove's network from the beginning, agreed to the revised terms in the 2nd week of March. The deal closed without ceremony, as most significant things close, with signatures and wire confirmations and a brief exchange of calls that were professional and slightly anticlimactic, because the real work had been the negotiation and the closing was just the record of it. Celeste told Rowan about it in a text message sent at 6:47. In the evening, deal closed. "Thank you for the clause review. Dinner tomorrow. The team. You're included." He read it standing in the kitchen while Tessa set the table, and the specific normality of that moment, his daughter arguing with a fork that wasn't sitting right, the smell of whatever they were having for dinner, the low sound of the city outside sat alongside the text message from his boss about $1 billion acquisition closing, and the 2 things did not conflict. They coexisted. That was new, and he recognized it as new, and he let himself recognize it without immediately moving past it. The team dinner was at a restaurant in Midtown that was not ostentatious. Celeste had specifically chosen against ostentatious, which Rowan had come to understand was a genuine preference rather than performance. It was a good restaurant, warm and moderately loud in the way restaurants are when people are actually talking to each other rather than being seen. Dina Vasquez came. Tom Okafor came. The other two team members, both hired within the past 6 weeks, came and spent the first 40 minutes being slightly formal before Dina said something dry about the parking garage security protocols that made Tom laugh, and the formality broke. Margaret Ellison came, because Celeste had invited her, and because Margaret went where she wanted to go, which was a thing Rowan had come to admire straightforwardly. Lenora came, because Lenora's involvement in the company's survival earned her a permanent place at tables like this one, and she sat between Margaret and Dina, and by the end of the evening had exchanged cards with both of them, which told Rowan that Lenora was always, on some level, working, and he respected that. Celeste sat at the center of the table in the way people sit when they are genuinely among people they've chosen rather than people they're managing, and she laughed twice during the dinner in a way that was unguarded, which Rowan had learned was not her default register in professional settings. It was good to see. It was the kind of good that doesn't need to be commented on to be real. After dinner, on the sidewalk outside, when the group was dispersing into cabs and the cold March air was doing its thing, Margaret Ellison stopped beside Rowan and said, without preamble, "She's different than she was in October." "Yes," he said, "so are you." He thought about this. Probably. Margaret looked at him with the assessment she'd given him over coffee in January, complete and without performance. "The thing about people who've spent a long time alone with heavy things," she said, "is that they get very good at the alone and very suspicious of the alternative, because being alone with something is painful, but it's predictable. The alternative is not predictable." She pulled her coat tighter. "Both of you are figuring out the unpredictability. That's not nothing." He didn't respond immediately, because it didn't need an immediate response. "She's lucky you were in that car," Margaret said. "I was doing my job. Everybody has a job," Margaret said. "Not everybody does it the way you did." She started toward the cab that had pulled up. "Good night, Rowan." "Good night, Margaret." He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, after her cab pulled away, in the cold air, with the city running itself around him the way it always does, regardless of what any individual person has been through, or is going through, or is about to go through. He thought about Dana. He thought about the years of adequate. He thought about a parking garage in the rain, and a service corridor, and a borrowed phone, and a woman who had said all right and meant it when it mattered most. He thought about Tessa at the kitchen table, 9 years old and precise, telling him the difference between quiet and calm. He thought about what he was now, standing on a midtown sidewalk in March, not the operator he had buried, not the minimum viable version of himself he had built to keep Tessa safe and fed and in school, but something in between that might, with time and honesty and continued imperfection, become something he couldn't fully name yet, but could feel the shape of. That was enough. More than enough. It was, he thought, most of what anyone ever got. He got in a cab and went home. Tessa was awake. She was supposed to be asleep, but she was not, which was a house rule she violated on evenings she found the sleep hard to find, and had learned she could violate as long as she was quiet about it and didn't push past 11. She was in the living room with a book and one lamp, and she looked up when he came in with the specific expression of a child who has been caught doing something permitted but slightly embarrassing. "How was dinner?" she said. "Good." He dropped his coat. "You're supposed to be asleep." "I know," she marked her page. "Was Miss Waverly there?" "Yes." "Was she happy?" He sat in the chair across from her and thought about Celeste laughing at the table, unguarded, in a way he'd only seen a handful of times. "Yes," he said, "I think she was." Tessa nodded, satisfied. "Good. She works too hard and she doesn't have enough people. She has more now. Because of you. Because of her. She built the foundation. The people around her are the ones she chose." He looked at his daughter. Some things take time to build correctly. Tessa seemed to accept this. She put her book on the side table and pulled her knees to her chest in the way she did when she was moving from awake to the beginning of tired and was not ready to admit it. "Yeah. Are you happy?" He had been asked this question by his daughter approximately 4 times in the years since Dana's death, always at unexpected moments, always with the specific directness that meant she wanted an actual answer rather than a reassuring one. The previous 3 times, his honest answer had been some version of, "Not unhappy, working on it, give me time." The answers had been true. They had not been enough. He sat in the chair across from his daughter, in the apartment they had built their life in the city that had been the backdrop for the worst night he could remember, and also, somehow, the beginning of something that had not yet found its complete shape, but was clearly, unmistakably, growing into one. "Yes," he said, "I am." Tessa looked at him for a long moment with her 9-year-old assessment, complete, unsentimental, honest, and then she said, "You mean it this time." "I mean it this time." She unfolded from the chair.
Okay.
She padded toward her bedroom in her socks. "Night, Dad. Night, Tessa." She stopped at the doorway. "Tell Ms. Waverly I said hi. Go to sleep. I'm going." She disappeared into her room. He sat in the quiet for a while. The city was out there, never silent, never finished, always moving toward something, or away from something, without stopping to explain which. He had lived alongside it for 5 years in survival mode, taking from it what he needed, and giving back the minimum required to keep the arrangement functional. He wasn't in survival mode anymore. He wasn't certain yet what mode came after, but he had a job that used what he actually was, and a daughter who was growing up watching someone try, and a set of people around him who had gotten there through honesty rather than performance. It wasn't perfect. The investigation was ongoing. The acquisition would need continued monitoring. 2 board seats were still empty, pending the completion of a governance review. Dina had flagged a third-party vendor relationship that warranted deeper scrutiny. Tessa had a math test next week she was less confident about than she was letting on. Margaret's back was still giving her trouble on cold mornings. Lenora was overworked in the way that people who are very good at what they do and deeply committed to it are chronically overworked. None of it was perfect. None of it had been designed to be. He thought about what his 12 years in the SEALs had actually taught him, underneath all the operational training and the physical conditioning and the team dynamics and the long stretches of waiting in places that wanted to kill him. What it had actually taught him, distilled to the thing underneath everything else, was this: the mission is never perfect, and the conditions are never ideal, and the people around you are never without their own damage, and you go anyway, and you do the work, and you bring everyone home that you can bring home, and you accept that some things are beyond the mission, and grieve them and move forward, and the forward movement is not a betrayal of the grief, it is the point of it. He had spent 5 years applying that principle exclusively to Tessa's childhood and his own survival. He was learning slowly and imperfectly to apply it to a larger life. That was the work. Not the acquisition, not the security protocols, not the federal investigation, or the board restructuring or the renegotiated deal. Those were the content of the work. The actual work, the one that mattered, at the level below, the professional and the logistical and the strategic, was learning to build a life that had room for more than one person in it, and to stop treating that room as a threat. He was not finished learning it. He suspected he would not be finished for some time. But he was further along than he had been in October, in a parking garage in the rain, sitting behind a wheel with his hands in the right position, and his eyes on a rearview mirror and a life that he had deliberately made smaller than he was because smaller felt safer. Smaller wasn't safer, it was just smaller. He turned off the lamp and went to bed. 4 months later, on a warm evening in July, Rowan and Tessa rode home together from Waverly Dominion's offices. She'd spent the afternoon on 38, as had become her occasional habit, and he'd finished a late meeting, and they'd shared the cab downtown with the easy comfort of people who have a routine. Tessa was quiet for most of the ride, which was unusual enough for him to notice. "What's going on in your head?" he said. She looked out the window for a moment. "You seem different." "Different how?" She thought about it with the precision she brought to things she was trying to say correctly. "When we moved to our apartment after Aunt Dana died, you held everything very tight, like you were worried about dropping things." She turned from the window. "You don't do that as much now." He watched her. "Is that good?" "I think so." She paused. "You used to come home, and it was like you were relieved to be here, but also tired from getting here." "Does that make sense?" "Yeah," he said. "It does. Now you come home and you just come home." She returned to the window. "Like, there's not as much distance between where you were and where you're going." He sat with that for the rest of the ride. She was not wrong. Something had shifted in the calculus of his daily life, not dramatically, not in the way things shift in stories where the shift is the point, but in the quieter and more durable way that real changes happen, which is incrementally and imperfectly, and usually without the moment of clear demarcation that would make them easier to identify. He had been fighting to get home for so long that home had become the finish line rather than the place. And you can't really live in a finish line. You can only collapse at it. The cab stopped. They got out. The evening was warm and the city was doing its summer thing louder, more present, the streets full of people who had decided that being outside was preferable to being in. Tessa took his hand as they walked toward the building, which she didn't always do anymore. She was 9, nearly 10, and the geography of what was acceptable in terms of parental hand-holding had been shifting, but she did it tonight, and he registered it without comment. In the elevator, she said, "Are you going to tell me I was right about taking the job? I already told you that. You said I was right. You didn't say what I was right about." He looked at her. "What were you right about?" She considered this with the gravity of someone who had been waiting to say something for a while and wanted to say it correctly. "That you were here," she said. "Like physically you were here. But part of you was waiting for permission to be here for real." She paused. "I don't know if I'm explaining it right." "You're explaining it right," he said. The elevator opened. They walked to the apartment. She took her shoes off at the door. The house rule she violated consistently had apparently been revised. Or possibly she was making an effort and dropped her bag on the chair and headed to the kitchen to investigate the refrigerator. With the energy of someone who has been politely eating catering. Sandwiches all afternoon and is now ready for actual food. Rowan stood in the doorway of his own apartment and looked at it, the permission slip holder on the wall, now housing a dentist reminder. The bowl in the drying rack, this time properly washed. The photograph of Dana on the shelf, framed in the frame Tessa had picked out at a street market 2 years ago, because it had small stars on the border, and she'd said Aunt Dana would have liked stars. The accumulated, ordinary evidence of a life that had been built, imperfectly, and with difficulty, by two people who needed each other, and had not always had enough of what the other person needed, but had kept trying. He thought about what Celeste had said in January in a cab about Petrosolis. People do things like that, small courageous things that nobody sees and nobody records. And sometimes those things are the difference. Dana had done that. The folder on the desk that had been Petrosolis's small courageous thing. The permission slip with 3 exclamation points that was Tessa's version of the same impulse, translated into the language of a 9-year-old who loved her father and was rooting for him in every way she knew how. The open door and the questions asked honestly, and the condition written into the arrangement, those had been Celeste's. He had been surrounded, without always seeing it, by people doing small courageous things on his behalf. And the least courageous thing he had done in the years since Dana died was spend so long surviving that he'd stopped building. Stopped believing that building was something he was still allowed to do. He was building now. Imperfectly, slowly, with all the rough edges that honest building has, and without any guarantee of how it would turn out, because nothing honest comes with a guarantee. But building, moving forward, letting the people who had chosen to be in his corner actually stand there without flinching away from the weight of being chosen. "Dad," Tessa called from the kitchen. "There's leftover pasta and also I found cheese." "Can we have both?" "Yes," he said. "Can we watch something?" "After homework." A pause. "I did it at Miss Waverly's office." "All of it?" "Most of it." "What's the most?" Another pause. "Most of the most." He put his keys on the hook by the door, a hook he had installed in the first week they'd moved in, because Tessa kept losing her keys, and which had become so fundamental to the apartment's architecture that he no longer noticed it and walked into the kitchen where his daughter was assembling an after-dinner snack with the determination of someone who considered this a project. He looked at her, this person he had organized his entire existence around for 5 years, who had organized her own existence around him, with equal dedication and considerably less acknowledgement, and thought, here, this is the thing. Not the job title, not the resolved investigation, not the acquisition that had closed, or the board that had been restructured, or the evidence that had been assembled in a conference room at 4 a.m. Not even the conversations in cars that had slowly become the kind of conversations that don't have an agenda. This, the kitchen, the pasta, the homework that was mostly done. The ordinary argument about snacks before dinner that was not really an argument at all, but a ritual, a way of being together that required no justification. He had spent years fighting to get home. He had come home. What he had not understood, until now, was that coming home and building one were different things, and that the second required more courage than the first, because coming home was a destination, and building was a continuous act, one that asked you to keep choosing, every day, to put something where there was nothing and believe it would hold. He was choosing, that was enough. That was, in the end, what anyone could do, choose, and continue choosing, and accept that the choosing itself was the point, and not the eventual arrival at some finished and permanent state, because finished and permanent was not how lives worked, not honest ones, not ones that had room in them for real people with real damage and real hope. He was not finished. He would not be finished. But he was here, and he was building, and the woman who had said all right in a parking garage and meant it was 10 blocks away, in a building that still had her name on it, making her own choices, building her own continued version of what she was becoming. And Tessa was eating pasta, and Dana's photograph had stars on the frame. And outside the window, the city went on, as it always did, as it always would, indifferent and inexhaustible, and full of the particular noise of a million people navigating the distance between where they are and where they are trying to go. He stood in his kitchen on a July evening and felt, quietly and without performance, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not because the road had been easy, not because the damage wasn't real, but because he had stopped waiting for permission to arrive at his own life and had started, at last, to live in it.